So today might be a longer-ish episode as I've worked for about 2 weeks or so to put this together. I wanted to make sure that I had the right words, and I did a little bit more research on this album because it was an album that I had been listening to for a long period of time. It came out basically at the end of 2014, I believe, and I didn't really listen to it until the beginning of 2015. But ever since then, this has been an album that has really pushed me through some rough patches in life, and it's an album that I always kind of refer back to. And there's nothing else to listen to. I'm in a music rut. I go back to this album and just get lost for a little while. The solid, hour-ish runtime of it really goes by pretty quick if you're trying to burn time. If you're interested in any type of metal or progressive metal genres, this is that album that will introduce you into hopefully a whole new area of metal, or maybe a whole new area of music you've never really experienced before. And if you're not into metal, well, maybe you'll give it a try, and this will be a gateway band or album to help you get there. So, without further ado, my name is Vox. This is Over Opinionated Podcast, and I am going to try to review music on this show as much as possible. So, thank you so much for listening. This is Over Opinionated. Although it is not their first studio album, this is their first album with the new lead singer, until further notice if they ever change, Michael Lessard. And I hope I'm pronouncing that last name right, but that's where we're going to go. Lessard was the singer of a progressive metal band titled or called Last Chance to Reason. They're from Maine. And without getting too much into the realm of Last Chance to Reason, they're more of a metalcore or of a gent style band in my opinion, and I wouldn't necessarily say that they would be a progressive metal band, but then again, I never really experienced progressive metal until this album, and going back and listening to Last Chance to Reason, I don't know, it just wasn't comparable to me. They had actually three album releases to date. I'm sure they had an EP or something along the line. In fact, I know they had an EP at some point. Level 1, 2, and 3 were released kind of a span across of several years, and they're all on 3 separate record labels. So, though I'm sure that the Last Chance had, or it has, a loyal following and a fan base, they never truly gained the attention that they wanted or actually deserved. I do listen to them, and I have listened to them since I've discovered the Contortionist. But I just, they never had like a big following, I guess. So they moved on, or Mike moved on. In 2013, Lessard announced that he was going to be becoming the full-time vocalist for the Contortionist, and that the Last Chance to Reason would become kind of a side project. He stated that discussions had started between him and Robbie Bacca, who is the guitar player for the Contortionist, and he played like keys and I'm sure a couple of other things on their earlier records. They were discussing the third album of the Contortionist, and he ended up flying back to Indianapolis after Last Chance to Reason finished their North American tour. And I guess the rest is history from there on out, because they started writing the album in which we now know, Language. Now, the Contortionist, this album is the pinnacle of their career at this point. They have 2 albums after this, which I'm not too big of a fan of. And maybe if I went back and listened to them and gave them a bigger shot, I would, but as I mentioned in the intro, this is an album that I continuously go back to, so hopefully they can either push back towards this experimental area of progressive metal, or, I guess they're on their own writing style, which is great, but it's just not my taste. There's only about a handful of albums, though, that I will comfortably listen to straight through without skipping a song. And I'm pretty happy to say that this is the album that I can do that with. One of the very few. Not to mention, I have successfully listened to this album, as I mentioned, multiple times a week. I think I've listened at some point, probably 2017, because I had already been listening to this album for like 2 years or so. I don't know. I think it was 2017 because I know I was working and stuff. I would listen to this album every single day on the way to school and back. I just constantly listened to it. From the very start, though, there's something not only mysterious but intriguing that grabbed me by the throat and kept me listening all the way through this album. The opening track, titled "The Source," is the one that makes me, or hopefully will make you, have your hair stand up on end. Like, I can, just talking about this, goosebumps, I know for a fact, ripple across the back of my neck. And I listen to music really loud, so this isn't like a very impactful track as far as loud, but it is impactful as a start of an album that will hold you to the end. Containing mostly vocals laid over other vocal tracks, so he's kind of doing a pretty cool melodic thing with his voice. There's some pretty spacey guitars and emotional piano and some synth chords that are in the back that sound like pads. So for those who don't know music, pads are just, they're not piano and they're not heavy synth, but they're just ambient sound. And god damn, is it good. It's a very small taste of what the absolute skill Lester brings with his vocals and his writing on this album. The spacey chords continue to push straight through to the next song, which is the second track, titled Language 1, Intuition. And it's very quickly accompanied by a beautiful distorted guitar. And I know you're thinking, how can a distorted guitar sound beautiful? It's peacefully distorted, if I will, because when I hear the description distorted guitar, I'm thinking of any kind of heavy metal, loud, gain-filled. This is a type of distortion that you can hear the chords and it isn't overpowering, and it gives a nice ambient feel that follows the rhythmic drums and the super dark bass line. And actually, the more that I kind of think about this as I'm going through the album, the bass line, the tone doesn't really fit in the song. And I wonder if they did that on purpose, because this album has a weird theme that follows through the whole thing. And if that's the case, then I guess my mind's kind of blown, because it took me a little bit longer to figure that out now, because yeah, wow, okay. So that just goes to show I'm figuring out more things as I'm talking about the album. I just listened to it again before I sat down to record this, and I can hear that bass line. It's just, it's interesting. I would be interested to see if they ever did an interview or something where they laid out how they wrote or how he wrote it, because I don't know who all had part in writing the music and the lyrics. Anyways, Intuition's vocal track does a beautiful blend between a clean vocal and a kind of scratchy, shrilly scream track, all while mentioning in the actual lyrics to drift with the ebb and the flow, which is the theme throughout the whole thing. I think that kind of highlights, again, going back to the bass line, it kind of highlights the differences between the light and the dark. So overlaying a clean vocal track with a screaming vocal track, it's very interesting. I'm kind of blowing myself away right now because I'm thinking about this. So I Googled it. According to the old Google, ebb and flow is a reoccurrent or rhythmic pattern of coming and going or decline and regrowth, which is basically exactly what continues through the third track, which is Language 2, Conspire. This track, though, it takes a little bit of a darker turn on it, which I guess is what they're saying. with the lyrics, and they're reflecting that into the music. It immediately goes to this deathcore style that the band was known for prior to Lessard's joining. And in my opinion, this is a nod to their roots, showing that they can stay true to where they came from, as far as their sound, but as well as pushing new boundaries to show that their talent as a whole. And it's just beautiful. The song quickly turns around, however, back to the lovely clean vocals, which wraps up beautifully. And it also gives us the first bit of silence that we've had in the album, because the first 3 tracks stretch a whole almost 12 minutes long of just fast and loud, energetic music. And the song just kind of ends, which is always a favorite thing of mine. And I mentioned this in a previous review that I really like the concept album style of music, where each song has a story to tell, but the whole album tells the story. So each song is a different chapter or a different perspective. And I always really like it when the artists decide to merge songs together. And I try to do that with my music that I produce, and it never comes out as direct as I want it to be, but when it pulls off correctly, it's a cool thing to hear. Integration in Thrive, which is the 4th and 5th track of the tracks of the album, they keep the theme pretty tight to the core for each song, mixing heavy sounds with clean vocals and heavy vocals with clean sounds. And you'll see that throughout the album as well, again, going back to the theme ebb and flow. The 2 songs are also sprinkled lightly with some kind of math and post-rock styles, just kind of strangely offbeat but on-beat drum patterns, and just some simple guitar riffs that are familiar to people who are into the rock scene, something that doesn't scream metal right off the bat or off the tip of the tongue while you're listening to it. And I'd even say that it dips a little bit into the djent branches or the hardcore area again, for just a moment, with how the drum patterns and the guitar patterns change, and they all kind of fall together in that. And if you're familiar with djent, don't smash me for that reference if you're listening to either of those songs, because just listen to the style of guitar. Although it might not be following the typical djent patterns, or actually I think it does follow more djent patterns and less of the djent sound. I think that's what I was trying to say when I'm thinking about it, because the djent sound is always really heavy and machine style guitar playing, but I feel like they get that in this. It wasn't really until the 6th track that I started to figure out what this project was about. And even then I wasn't really sure, but listening to the lyrics of the song, it was more straightforward once I realized what the name of the track meant. Primordial Sound features lyrics such as, "What you seek, the obsolete, the answers are no use to you now," echoing out. And another line that really hits the nail on the head, "All within is all without, all you know versus all you don't." It really started to make sense to me when I thought about the whole ebb and flow theme. And I know I keep mentioning that, but it's very important through this album. And it really makes more sense to me the more I think about that now, as I mentioned, because to this day I feel like I comprehend it more and more as I listen to it, as the underlying theme, not only to this album, but maybe to life itself. And this is where my research came in, and I'll go back into the life itself part in a minute. But primordial sound seems to be interpreted differently, in different ways. And depending on how you look at it, from what I understand and from what I can take away from saying the saying primordial sound, is it's the sound of life or nature that is surrounding one or you. It's often referred to during the times of meditation. And when I was searching this, I used Google, and then used a couple of Wikipedia pages, and found that a a lot of people use primordial sounds to focus on yourself and as like stress relief. I even saw a page that referred to primordial sounds in the current day, which was funny to me because I was like, "What do you mean current day?" But it's not so much sounds of nature, like where people have white noise machines or like to listen to the sound of the ocean or birds chirping. It's like more children playing or traffic in the distance. It's just like sound that is being presented around you that you can't control. But the part that I found during both then and now research, because when I started this a couple weeks ago, I started to dip into it, and then I started it again when I finished listening to the album and wanted to figure out what I wanted to say. It's more of, and this is just my interpretation, it's more of like referred to the sounds of soul in the afterlife, maybe that's what the song is trying to say, maybe that's what he's trying to say. And take everything with a grain of salt, but that's just, you guessed it, my opinion on what I wanted to say. But going back to mention the underlying theme of the album and what I was saying with that song is the whole primordial sound thing made sense to me, because I started to dig through more of Lessard's explanation, of the album itself. And he did an interview with Metal Insider, I believe, and he kind of gave the idea behind the album, and I think it's pretty cool the way that people write and use inspiration from their lives or what they wanted to do in their genre of music and their style of people that they're the audience that they're playing for or writing for. So in this interview, he goes on to say a couple of things, and we'll start with the beginning. He says, "There wasn't anything I wanted to slap in anyone's face. The album is very much about pulling whatever meaning you want from it, which is why the lyric of the last song, 'You are the perceiver that perceived the parable.'" And I know we're not to that point in this review, but I wanted to just share his thoughts on the album, and it kind of really pushed my thoughts when I was reading this to see where he went. He continues to say, basically, that they're dictating what the story is, which is why we didn't release the lyrics. And I actually fought over, that with management and the label for a while, which is very funny to me because he actually fought not to release lyrics for his songs that he was writing, and obviously the label and management wanted him to do that, but I didn't find the lyrics until I started using Genius, and that's where I get a little bit of this information from as well. And I mentioned that before. Obviously, it's not a paid sponsor or anything, and they're not sponsoring it, but I really like Genius. There's a lot of cool things on there. There's a lot of fans that come together and talk about music theory, song theory, and they get to collaborate on what they believe lyrics are, what they believe the meanings behind songs are, and also share little specks of information like this interview. He continues, "It's obviously a very positive album in a lot of ways, which I agree with. At that point in my life, I just felt like something I needed, and it's something that I think the scene doesn't have too much of, which is true. Metal is full of a lot of pretty dark themes and dark sounds. It's usually a lot of dark, negative topics, as I just mentioned. I was hoping it would be something for someone to listen to and escape. It's really cool to see the response in the connection some people have to the album. Going through the meat grinder of the album cycle, it is really easy to forget that some people's perspective on the record is way different from the perspective you have. It shocks me, but it's also a very cool thing when people come up and say that the record helped them through some tough stuff, which is exactly the point that I was trying to make. And I'm going to say, okay, hold on, we'll get there in a minute, because there's a little bit more. So about 3 years after the release of the album, Lessard had another interview with Revolver and told them what the album was actually about. So this is 3 years after the interview, I'm assuming, with the first magazine or whatever it was, and Metal Insider. And not that he was lying during that interview, but maybe he just wasn't comfortable in sharing the entire story until the time was right. And I'm really glad that he came out and said the rest of this, because it's pretty freaky in my opinion. He says in this interview, Language was written about a close friend of mine who had passed away. His mother passed away a year earlier, and he started to battle with addiction. He then lost the battle a year later, and it was around that time that we started writing Language. For me, I needed to write a positive album that was my outlet. That's what I had to focus on, so I wrote the album based on a metaphor about a mother-son relationship and the nurturing light that a mother gives to her son and guidance. So I didn't get so much the mother-son nurturing and guidance part, but I did get the underlying tone, as I said, of the ebb and flow, the dark and the light, the destruction and reconstruction, or death and regrowth, death and rebirth, whatever. And this is where my experience comes in, and that's why I said, hold on, we'll go back there in a minute. I lost a really good friend in the summer of 2018, and it pretty much made it a really rough end of the year for me. And the freakier thing is that about a year after his mother passed, he passed. So it was kind of, I don't know, one of those, again, goosebump moments, chills down your spine moments when I read that, because he wrote this album about someone who had lost his mother and then lost himself. And not that that is the exact situation that my friend was in, but it's pretty damn close. And I don't know, it kind of hit a soft spot, you know. And although I had been listening to this album repetitively for years before this, I went back to this album after my friend's passing, because it was an album that gave me that metal, fix that I needed. And it also made me feel pretty damn good. And it was very relieving and comforting that someone was going through the same thing and was writing an album about it. And again, the freaky part is I had been listening to this album for at least 3 years before my friend passed, and it was about his friend passing. So I really feel for him. I feel for you, dude. To continue, the 7th track of this album is titled Arise. And it's the only track on the album that I would actually consider to be a filler song, as it's the shortest song on the album next to the opening track. And the opening track, although it is important to how the album starts, I don't necessarily think that it would be a song that you would just listen to on shuffle. Like if you're listening to a bunch of playlists, you wouldn't put that song in a playlist and have it come on shuffle, because it's an opening track. Yeah, it's a couple minutes long, but it's not just a standalone song. It's a 3-parter, So in fact, the last 60 seconds of Arise has the best performance both vocally and musically. So in a way, I often can't wait for that song to end, because I know it gets good at the end. And it's not a song that I skip. It's just not a song that I favor. The 8th track is the real winner of the album, though, and it's finally reaching the point of that album that we were all hoping for while listening to it, and that we would all know is coming. It's the pinnacle of the album. Ebb and Flow, which is the 8th track, takes about a minute to really pick up, but once it does, it's an awesome ride of both ups and downs for 7 straight minutes. Awesome melodic patterns, and incredibly heavy and scattered guitars and drums. It's wishy-washy. It's like it can't figure out what it wants to do or what it wants to be or where it wants to go. And it's giving a nod back to the title and the theme of the album, of course, and why wouldn't it? The entire song reflects the same feeling I have with the opening track. I get goosebumps every time, and when it wraps up, it's perfectly subtle. The heaviness disappears, the instruments fade out, and it is all vocally done. And it's a beautiful piece of work. And that album, or that song, will single-handedly bring me to tears. It is a very strong and passionate and powerful track. The ninth track smooths the album out completely. There's just enough heaviness scattered through the track where it doesn't kind of throw you off, and you don't end on a sour note per se. The Parable is a good rap, but I always feel like it falls short compared to the previous track. And I think that's kind of, I don't know if that's necessarily the way that they wanted to go, but I think that's kind of important for the album because it's the climax is at the 8th track and the ending's at the 9th. So it kind of makes sense, but it's one of those songs that I always feel a little bit haunted by. It's good. It's good. I'm trying to put this into words. I guess I didn't really think about how I wanted to say it, but for some reason the track just brings over some sort of haunting feeling, and it just leaves me unsettled for some reason, and I'm not sure why. It's just how I always feel after listening to it. The track before it is very positive. It gives me a good feeling, and then this track, it just kind of lays flat. Not that it's a bad track. I don't know. It doesn't quite do it for me as a album ender, but I think that's a good thing. So you want to re-listen to the album and get back to those moments of feeling good. Those highs and those, heavy lows are always something that I look for. Overall, though, this album really, in my opinion, pushes the boundaries, and it doesn't limit itself to the one progressive metal style that I've heard while trying to find something similar to listen to. Something that would give me the same feeling as the album, I haven't found yet. If you've never listened, I really encourage you to go back and rethink how your music tastes are, and hopefully you would venture into this album excited and trying to find something new. And if you have listened to the album and you didn't have any idea what the lyrics meant, or maybe you're one of those people that just listens to the music, try to sit down and re-listen to it and figure out what your feeling is about the lyrics and what you take away from it, because I think his first interview really sets a standard for his writing style and set the standard for the album. And although he came out later on and said this is what it's actually about, I think it's important that someone thinks that an album can have anything taken away from it and have any kind of feeling given to someone, because I'm sure that there's people out there that would hear a country song and feel really good about it and love the lyrics, and it gives them a good nostalgic feeling about whatever that person's singing about. The same way that, to me, metal or this song or album does, for me, because I hear country and I'm like, yuck, this puts me in a bad mood. And I know for a fact there's a lot of people in the world that listen to metal or a conjunction or hybrid or experimental version of metal and go, yuck. There's a lot of people that do metal covers of country songs or pop songs and they don't like it, but it is what it is, Metal for me has always been a genre that I go to get out of a funk if I'm feeling down that day, or maybe I'm just angry and need something to make myself feel better. I always reach to metal to see if, anything that I listen to will help me. And it usually does. And I'm sure people do that with all types of music. And I think that's the best part of music, is that there's so many different genres and there's so many different music styles. And I mean, just music as a whole is something that we can turn to and relate together as humans, relate together as, metalheads or funk junkies or just people that like to listen to rap and hang out with their friends, or, whatever you may do with whatever music. It's important to get something out of it. And I really wish that more people would say, this is a piece of art that I put together that does have a story, but I want you to make it. The story is what you take out of it. If it isn't obvious already, I'm going to give this album a solid 10 out of 10 on the Vox's music scale. And I really hope that it influences you to listen to new things if you decide to check it out. And I really hope that my opinion or descriptions on things influence you to listen to it or other things. I know it was kind of a weird review, but I think that's going to be how it is for albums that I talk about that really mean a lot to me. And obviously, everyone has lost something or someone, and I think that we all have a vice to fix what we have lost, fill that void. And if you related to that feeling, I feel for you, and I hope that you're doing better now. I know for a fact that the next album that I'm going to review is probably going to be the same style of, not music, but style of dissecting songs and how each one has a meaning and how it made me feel. Because, I want to be a music reviewer for some reason. Regardless, if you made it this far, thank you so much for listening. I know posts are sporadic, and I do want to mention that because some people do listen to this when it comes out. But if you're discovering this, a year from when it was posted, awesome. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Vox, and this is Overopinionated Podcast, the wannabe music review podcast for now. I don't know.